Well, we have a great pleasure ahead of us. We have President Kim and President Wolfenson, who will have a conversation here with us as soon as you all sit down and be quiet. And we look forward to, I'm sure, a scintillating session. All right, gentlemen. Thank you.
Jim, I think you're here.
Here? Okay.
You're here, I think. Well, friends, we've had a busy morning up to now, and now we have another highlight, which I'm very pleased to be part of. I've come to know President Kim since he's been here, and had a good opportunity to discuss a number of matters with him, and I know full well that he is a wonderful choice for the job at the World Bank. Of course, he's greatly fitted for it with his academic background, his work both as a physician, and he took time to be an anthropologist, which is really helpful in the World Bank, given the number of people we deal with, both inside and out. And he has done public service before, as I think all of you know, in terms of the work that he did, particularly in the area of AIDS, which is another very pressing problem for us. The fact that he went to Brown and a couple of degrees from a little-known institution called Harvard, which is down the street, has fit him very well for this job. But what's most important about Jim Kim and his family is that he is devoting himself wholeheartedly to reassessing the priorities of the bank, refocusing it on the key issues, and he's giving personal leadership and unrelenting leadership to his role. So we're very happy to welcome you here today, Jim, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I just want to start off by saying that it's really a wonderful privilege and an honor to be here with you. Those of you who've known the Bretton Woods institutions for a long time know that that Jim, as he left office, was just an absolutely beloved figure. And I feel like there's, no matter what, we'll always be measured up against what you were able to accomplish. Yeah. And frankly, so many of the things that we're tackling right now were really initiated and championed by Jim. Jim was the first president to really tackle the issue of climate change in a really serious way. He always emphasized poverty. He emphasized being in the villages with the poorest, understanding their struggles directly. The voices of the poor was really a signal achievement and direction. And so we're just trying to finish the job, Jim. We walk.
That's the last about me, Jim.
We walk in the door every day, and Jim had inscribed on the wall of the World Bank group, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." So as I walked in the door on my first day, I said, "So what can we do to turn this dream into a reality?" And the team got going, and now this is very much, Jim. I feel that we're very excited to be in this role where when you started, probably 40% of the people in the world were living in absolute poverty, and now we're at 20, and we have a chance to actually get to 3%. And so it's a special privilege and delight to be here with you.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I was told that maybe I should ask some questions, but I would love to get some remarks from you first as to sort of the framework we'd like to set for the discussion.
Well, one of the things that we've tried to do, Jim, and I know you did this too, is we try to understand, so in this day and age where, official development assistance has declined for 2 years in a row, and that hasn't happened for a very long time. But moreover, I think that we have to have a much clearer understanding of what all the sources of financing are going to be if we are to have truly ambitious aspirations for the poorest. And if we're to have truly ambitious aspirations, ending poverty by 2030, boosting shared prosperity, ensuring that the bottom 40% of earners in any society participate in economic growth, we're going to have to look at big issues like infrastructure. We have to look at big issues like investments in human capital. And so if you look at just the BRICS countries, $4.5 billion in infrastructure deficits over the next 5 years. Over the next 5 years. India itself has a 4.5 trillion in infrastructure deficits. India itself, 1 trillion. And when I went to India, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister both told me 1 trillion in infrastructure deficit, half of it will come from public resources and half has to come from the private sector. And our challenge is how do we build those kinds of public-private partnerships that both help the private sector make money, because we know that they'll stop investing if they don't make money, while at the same time achieving our development goals. And so this is a huge issue. So if ODA is 125 billion a year, over 5 years, that's what about a little over $500 billion. So even if you took all the ODA in the world, it wouldn't meet India's infrastructure needs. So I think that we're living in a time when we just have to be humble about what institutions like the bank can do just with the foreign assistance kind of money we get, and think about what we can do and to be catalysts, not only of building those public-private partnerships, but I think there's an understanding that every country is going to have to do better in terms of increasing domestic resources, building their tax base in places where there hasn't been a tax base. And so for me, it's not a question of whether you're focused on public-private. It's a question of how big are your aspirations for the poorest. Yours were huge, Jim. Your aspirations were always huge. And so to follow in that spirit, if our aspirations are truly large, then we know that we have to help countries increase their domestic resources. We have to make sure that ODA is invested as absolutely strategically. It's so precious. The 125 billion we get every year is so precious. We have to make sure that they're invested in the most strategic ways. And then we have to figure out ways of crowding in private investment. But for us, the World Bank, specifically, it's not just any kind of private sector project. It's those projects that are going to have a transformative impact and help countries achieve their development goals.
Jim, you have articulated, you've recommitted to ending poverty by 2030 and to boosting shared prosperity for the bottom 40%, also by 2030. But I wonder if you could comment on the way in which you've now got the World Bank Group much more balanced in terms of what it does. I believe that IFC, for example, is now roughly the same impact as the World Bank in terms of its investments. I wonder if you could talk about that, because I think many people don't know about that, or indeed the way I think you conceive of the institution, I think in 3 parts. And I think it'd be very interesting if you could expand on that.
Well, so when you started in 1995, Jim, IFC was really very small, kind of a small boutique operation inside the World Bank Group. But now it's fully a third of our portfolio and increasing in size. And so we're really, IFC is about 15 billion, IBRD is about 15 billion, and IDA is about 15 billion now. And on any given year between 45 and 50 some billion. But moreover, every single one of our governors at the spring meeting said to us, this is great, we like the 2 goals. Your huge comparative advantage is that you can potentially work across the public and private sector. And so one of the things we've emphasized, and we've actually made a change, Jim, you'll be interested in it. We brought information technology, external relations, and human resources together. So IFC, MIGA, IBRD, IDA, all of the employees now are part of a single group. And this has never happened before. I mean, IFC was always quite separate. And so now we've got a set of employees that are World Bank Group employees. And at first there was noise in the system, There's always a little bit of noise in the system. But I think they're coming together well, and it's a part of a larger process. Now, there are some specific characteristics of IFC that we want to, of course, preserve. They're much more entrepreneurial, they're deal makers, they move quickly. We need to preserve that. But, for example, if you look at the problem of energy in Nigeria, they have about 20% of the energy they need. And right now, they're paying much more than they should. I don't know what the price is today per kilowatt hour, but it's multiples of the 9 cents per kilowatt hour or so that we pay here in Washington. So the only way to solve that problem is to try to find paths toward major public-private partnerships that would not only be good for the companies that invest, but they could also dramatically lower the price of electricity and increase access for Nigeria. So those are the kinds of projects that we need to do. I mean, Myanmar, we're aggressively moving forward in Myanmar to try to come up with an energy project, and there's a very specific concern here. I was just at a G7 meeting, and Wolfgang Schäuble said one of the responsibilities of the G7 is to show the world that market-based democracies are the best form of government, and that there is a dividend to evolving toward a market-based democracy. And so for us, we feel that in countries like Myanmar, we have to move quickly. And again, unless you have this approach to public-private partnerships, we won't move as quickly. We won't be able to provide enough sustainable financing. And we've got to be able to show, with a combination of guarantees, public sector investment, private sector investment, that we can move quickly and effectively in, for example, demonstrating to the people of Myanmar that by moving to market-based democracy, that they're going to get so many benefits, including much cheaper, much more available energy.
And Jim, when you look at the way in which it's forming up with this tripartite background, another thing which is happening is that some of your traditional clients, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, are now stretching their own muscles.
Yeah.
And they're saying, well, we're putting together a fund. And South Africa, I think, was invited to join them. Could you tell us what sort of impact that has? Is it real? Is it covering the whole thing or not?
Well, so what is the talk of the BRICS Bank? What is that teaching us? I think it's the most predictable thing you can imagine. So in the BRICS countries, if there's $4.5 trillion in infrastructure deficit over the next 5 years, and even in this very low interest environment, these countries are having trouble finding access to long-term capital for the kinds of infrastructure investments they need, they're saying, what's the solution? And so I think it's the most natural thing that they're looking for different kinds of solutions. But we've taken notice, and we know that we've got to think of innovative ways of helping them solve their problems. So we're working on the development of something we're calling a global infrastructure facility. Now, the global infrastructure facility is going to fully use all of our different instruments. So on the one hand, it could partly be a trust fund, and we have a lot of trust funds, but a trust fund that even is funded partly by the middle-income countries, by the BRICS countries. And in addition, we now have something called the Asset Management Corporation, Jim. It's basically a fund where sovereign wealth funds and other investors can put their money and invest along with IFC. So some combination of public-private where we're really able to then bring our technical expertise in helping the BRICS countries and other middle-income countries build this $4.5 trillion worth of infrastructure that they need. We're moving quickly because this is what they're asking for us. We need to find ways of increasing access to the kind of long-term capital that middle-income countries and even the poor countries need. So totally predictable. We welcome it. If the BRICS Bank were to be formed, I still think that there would be trouble finding enough capital to meet all the needs. We're stepping up. We're going to be as innovative as we can be. But there's a race here. I mean, if we look at our goal to end poverty, there's no question that India has to be a huge part of that. 400 million people still living in absolute poverty in India. And so if they're to accomplish their goal, which is to lift 300 million people out of poverty by 2030, we're going to have to help them find those infrastructure investments that they need right now. It's just a reflection of the enormous growth of those countries over time and their continuing need for more investment.
And this morning we had a speaker from the Inter-American Development Bank, and they're doing a lot of creative things. And it occurred to me that in relation to all the regional banks and the literally dozens of other development banks that have come out in many countries, either single countries or groups of countries, that you now have a whole industry of development activities. How is it that that can be managed? Is it possible? Do you have a leading role? Are they resentful of you? What is the story?
Well, again, there's so much of what I'm doing that's just taking a page out of your book, Jim. You had regular meetings with the heads of the multilateral development banks, and so we're doing the same thing. We've met since I've been president. We've already met 3 times, we've met 4 times. In one of the meetings, we actually had the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon join us, and this was the first time in history that the Secretary General had met with all the heads of the multilateral development banks. And I think the bottom line is, even with all our money together, even with all our money combined, putting it all together, it's still not enough to meet the needs of development. So I certainly don't feel competitive. I think it would be a shame if we didn't coordinate our efforts so that we had the maximum development impact. If I were to sit back though and say, well, what's the difference between us and all of them? I think what we bring to the table, what we bring as sort of added value to the table is that we're global. We have 188 member countries. We have experience working now. We're in over 100 countries actively working. Our expertise in areas ranging from road building to climate change to healthcare and education, I think is still tremendously valuable for everyone. And I also think that the tremendous amount of experiential knowledge, people who've actually worked on projects and completed them, is also a huge value added for all the different organizations. And my intention is to work ever more closely. Soon I'll be traveling to the Great Lakes region with the Secretary General. And our commitment is that when we go to places like that, we're recognizing the fact that in places like the Great Lakes and the Sahel, even in places like Myanmar and Afghanistan, political security and economic development solutions should come together. And to the extent possible, we should try to make them work together. In other words, we're going to do this as long as you abide by the peace agreement. Set up some sort of win-win situations, some virtuous cycles that could help us be more effective. It's been already very helpful to have such a close relationship with the Secretary, with the UN system. The CEB meetings, the Chief Executive Board meetings, Jim, we've turned them into working sessions so that every single Chief Executive Board, that's the head of all the UN agencies plus the heads of the international financial institutions, we've set them up so that every 6 months we get together, we take 3 or 4 countries, we bring the representatives, the UN res reps and the country directors, we bring them to the table and we say, how are you doing on the MDGs? And bring us your worst problem, your most difficult problem. And at the table, as you sit with us, we're going to make commitments to you to solve those problems. And so we started with Ghana, Niger, and Tanzania, and it was very exciting. Just the fact that they were going to get to come to that table made them think bigger. So there's some very exciting possibilities coming out of that particular relationship, but that's just how we have to work. I think that in the 1940s, the global community always intended for the UN and the international financial institutions to work that closely. And it harkens back to the days of Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Jim Wolfenson, right? You've told that story many times.
Well, when Boutros was the Secretary General, we used to have meetings, and then publicly I was called Jim, and Michel
Kamdesu, right?
Kamdesu was called Michel. And people thought we were nuts when we were going around. We spoke like this, but that and other things brought us together. But what you're doing, Jim, is clearly an extension of that, and I congratulate you. I have another 20 questions, but I'm sure this is a great chance for, as you'll see, I don't want to hog. My God. Okay, Dick.
Yes, go ahead.
Ambassador Gardner, you don't probably know.
Tremendously impressed by your leadership at the World Bank, and you're uniquely qualified to answer the question I'm about to put, given your background in the medical field and health and human rights. I'd like you to discuss the issue of population growth and specifically family planning. It's one in which Jim took leadership and still does. In countries where population is doubling every 25 to 35 years and are already in extreme poverty, it's hard to see how you can make progress or how you can have political stability. I think Pakistan, Afghanistan, as well as some of the poorer African countries. So we don't seem to be really making much progress on the population issue in some of those countries. Would you like to tell us how you see the way forward?
Well, I mean, this was an argument and a discussion that was fairly intense many decades ago, and the notion was that you had to stop population growth. But I think we've learned a lot since then, and basically in many ways, Malthus was brilliant, but he was wrong on a lot of issues. And I think what we've seen is that if you focus on economic development, that the birth rate often goes down. But it's not one-to-one relationship, and there's nothing simple about it. I'm a medical doctor. I believe in reproductive rights. I believe in access to all the tools that the women need to be able to stay healthy and control their bodies. This is something that I believe in, and I think that when you educate girls, that when you provide development opportunities specifically for women, and I think you have to focus on this. I think you really have to focus on this. Gender equality, another issue that Jim championed, it has to now turn into something very practical. We can say things like, well, gender equality will inform all our projects, and that's very important. Just to know what the impact a project will have on women is really important. But then there's another step. For example, one investment that IFC has made in China led to the development of women's branches in rural areas in China, branches of banks that specifically are made for women, because what they found was that women were reluctant to try to get small business loans in the regular bank branches. So they developed women's specific focus on women's access to capital. That's also really important. I think if we educate girls, if we are sure that women have access to bank accounts and capital, that we do everything we can to combat gender discrimination, I think it's important. And I think that that I have a specific role to play. I'll tell you, I was in a country that was very strongly influenced by Islam, and one of the leaders of those countries said to me that it's very difficult for them around the issue of gender equality because of their culture. Now, he stepped in the wrong place because I'm an anthropologist, right? And I said to him, in 1959 when I was born in South Korea, I bet the status of women in South Korea was worse than the status in your country in 1959. But over time, the Korean people learned that in order for them to grow quickly, they needed women to work in the factories, that they needed women to have education, and women now are representing about 50% of those who are getting educated in universities. And last year, they elected a woman president. Now, it's not as if there's no problems with gender equality in Korea, but the birth rate was very high in Korea in 1959. And now the big concern is that there are not enough births happening in Korea. So what I said to them, though, was, and I'll tell you, today in Korea, I don't think that they would say that Confucian culture has died. So please don't tell me that culture restricts you from moving toward gender equality. I consider those two things separate, right? So I have a role to play. If we can make progress on educating girls, on reproductive rights, on access to capital, even just access to financial services, I think you'll see what we've seen in so many other cultures. And so my own approach is not to enter a situation looking to limit population growth. I think the better approach is to really focus on gender equality. Okay.
We'll call on someone who's a lady. Madam.
Good morning, President Kim. My name is Xiaohui Wu. I'm from George Washington University. My question is, yesterday I read an article from a major Chinese website, which they claim was written by you. And if it's true and if I understand it correctly, you emphasize the word deliver. So how the government can really reach the people in need and turn their magnificent plan into reality. So I think that, what do you think the World Bank can really help the government to better deliver? So do you think it will be helpful if the World Bank recruits and send more expertise to these countries and how directly help them to implementing their plans? And my second question is that...
I'm sorry, ma'am. We've got a lot of people. We just have one question.
That's a great question, though. So first of all, that was an article. It was actually a series of articles I did for LinkedIn, and we sent them to China. But here, this is critical for me, because I come into the World Bank having worked in development for 20 or 30 years. And what I found is that just like in health and education, the areas where we have the most profound aspirations. I have been frustrated for the last 30 years in watching how, when it comes to our most cherished social goals, better health, better education, social protection, environmental sustainability, when it comes to our most cherished social goals, not only do we tolerate poor execution, we often celebrate poor execution. Poor execution is often thought of as a symbol of how much we care about the topic. We're not, these heartless business types who focus just on execution. We feel the issue. That's great. But at the end of the day, poor people, those who are left out, don't care how much we feel about the issue. They want to see execution. And this has been my struggle forever. Now, this is a problem in just about every social field. In healthcare, what is the problem of healthcare in most developed countries? We feel that as long as you have scientific research that give us new insights and that you train trustworthy individuals, once you put good information in the hand of trustworthy individuals, people think the job is done. And what happens is in healthcare, we've not focused on delivery enough. There are very few doctors, almost none in fact, who are trained not in treating patients, but trained in how to set up delivery systems that will actually get you what you want at the end of the day, which is healthy people, not more treatment, healthy people, right? So many of our social systems, in my view, are completely misaligned, and it's, in my view, it's because we haven't focused enough on delivery. Because delivery is messy. It's systems, it's human resources, it's leadership, it's management and operations, complicated systems, and we've ignored that. And I think we've ignored that in development as well. So for example, if you go around the world to the poorest countries in Africa, healthcare, an area that I know very well, is completely fragmented. And there are multiple organizations demanding their own reports and their own infrastructure. It's a mess because we've thought that because we had a good impulse, we want to help poor countries improve their healthcare, and we're going to get the countries to change their policy, whatever mess is on the ground is sort of an expression of our goodwill. It's not enough. It's not enough. And I'm going to be at the World Health Assembly this year pounding on the table saying we've got to stop this. We've got to build integrated systems that can deliver across the priorities, and this is fundamentally a delivery problem, right? So at the World Bank, thank you. At the World Bank, the good news is the place is just full of master implementers, because these are people who have PhDs in economics, PhDs in engineering, but who for years have had to deal with this messy business of actually making it happen. So when I came into the World Bank and I said, it's great, you guys are like all these master implementers, they came back to me and said, that's how we've always seen ourselves. But that's something that hasn't been developed enough. So we're going to try to build what we're calling a science of delivery in development at the World Bank. And it's not even building something, it's just making sure that people talk to each other. So for example, if there's an innovation in one country, Sometimes it doesn't even spread to the other district in that country. What can we do to capture innovation and have it spread immediately all over the world and then adapted for the local context? It's a simple idea, but it's really hard to do. So that's a big focus. Now, when I went to China, not 5 minutes into my discussion with now Premier Li Keqiang, he said, we really like working with you. The next issue we want you to help us with is urbanization. So they felt that they weren't even really able to capture all the innovations in urbanization that were happening inside China, let alone bringing to China all the innovations that were happening in the rest of the world. So the Chinese are very focused on delivery in terms of how they build cities. In South Africa, the same thing. South Africa said, you know, we have great policies, and we even have money, but our problem is delivery. And it keeps repeating itself. So when I came in and said delivery, I wasn't sure what the response would be in the countries, but the response has been overwhelming. They keep saying, yes, that's my problem. Good policy, financing is in place. We just can't make the system work. Can you help us with that? That's the intention. Jim,
We have 16 minutes and 7 more people to ask questions. And I've worked out that if you continue answering as you are, we'll be here till 3:30.
Well, I covered.
I love the answers.
I covered all my favorite issues,
Yeah,
so
well, you
I'll
did.
be briefer now. Yeah.
So I think what we'll do is now take 2 questions at a time.
Sure.
And so we'll have you next, and then we'll go to you, and we'll see how quickly we can do this. Please.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Waldrop with American University. My question is on climate change. It's been great to see the World Bank become more involved in addressing climate change as an issue for the poor. But I'm also curious about how the IFIs can address problems in developed countries with instituting policies that are appropriate given the scale of the problem. And in particular, since there's this narrative of progress focused on economic growth, but we know that if the entire developed world comes to the same level of development and consumption that we have in the U.S. and Europe, that's not going to work with climate change. So I'm wondering if you could address that.
Okay, great.
And the second one, please.
Good morning. My name is Frank Vogel. I'm with the Partnership for Transparency Fund and Transparency International, and we enjoy working with the World Bank, and we want to work much more with you. Last week, Kofi Annan's panel on Africa produced an important report and focused particularly on the 20 resource-rich countries that the IMF has identified in sub-Saharan Africa, where, frankly, the poverty data is absolutely horrendous in many of those countries, not all, in many of them. It's an important report, but where does the World Bank fit in here? These are countries with rising FDI, rising export incomes, terrible infant mortality statistics, and so on. How is the bank, particularly on those 20 countries, going to intervene, or help them rather, and influence them to readdress that situation? Thank you.
Great questions. So on climate change, you know, I think that that most people understand that we've got to find a stable price on carbon, whether that's taxes or a carbon market. You know, and a lot of people have different ideas about it. We've got to find that, and I think that you know, if we can, despite all the setbacks recently with the price on carbon, I think that with continuing extreme weather events, with increasing awareness, especially the awareness that things that we thought would only happen at 2 degrees Celsius are happening now, I think there is a good possibility over the next few years of finding a way to get a stable price on carbon. But there's so much else that we need to do. We need to find ways of removing fuel subsidies, and there's also fantastic opportunities. You know, one of the things that I would say is that we are very committed to finding a sustainable path for economic growth for the poorest countries. You know, I think it's completely unfair to say to the poorest countries that the rich countries polluted the air, therefore you're going to have to wait for your energy until we feel it's okay and for you. I just don't, that's not fair. We have to find ways of getting people energy. But I think there are lots of possibilities so that the poor countries can still have economic growth and still have access to energy. Africa, I think there's enormous possibilities for hydroelectric power, for geothermal power, for solar and wind-based microgrids in the rural areas. You know, what we know is that the demand for renewable energy sources in the developing countries is going very, very rapidly. Al Gore said to me that we've seen nothing grow this fast unexpectedly before, other than the cell phone, which of course exploded. No one, people said it was going to be 200 years before rural areas in India had access to telephones. But of course, it's a completely different picture. So I'm more optimistic. In the meantime, what the World Bank is focusing on climate smart agriculture, urbanization, if we can build cleaner cities, and access to energy, especially access to renewable sources of energy. Those are three areas where we can aggressively work right now. And I think over time, the developing countries, the realization that this is an issue, that climate change is an issue, is growing. Every single G20 meeting, when I have a chance to talk about downside risks in the global economy, I talk about climate change. And the finance ministers are very concerned with other issues like currency and other kinds of things, but almost all of them come up to me afterwards and at least say, keep saying this. I know this is not high on the agenda right now, but we've got to tackle the issue. As far as minerals, we're part of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and I think that we have to find a way. First of all, one of the things that we found is that just some of the contracts are awful, and that the developing countries that have these minerals have not entered into deals that are favorable for them. And I think we have to have several conversations. One, we talk about the natural resource curse, that somehow when there are natural resources, other parts of the society don't develop as they should. I think there's a lot of work we need to do to make sure that these countries that are mineral rich continue to do all the other things we know they need to do in order to secure the future of their country. But the other is, I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to have a conversation about how you can take part of the resources and use them for health, education, social protection programs. We've already begun to have those conversations.
Thank you. Let's take these two first, and then we'll go to the two endnotes. Would you like to start?
Thank you. I'm Keiichiro Nakaza from JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. My question is about your expectation on the coming TICAD meeting in Yokohama. If, putting India and China aside, 2/3 of the world extreme poverty live in fragile states. And if we look at area-wise, again, putting aside India and China, 2/3 of the world extreme poverty lives in Africa. So, in order to tackle with and achieving the goal of the extreme poverty be 3%, fragile states in sub-Saharan African countries are the kind of key. So, what kind of discussions you like to hear and you'd like to make in Yokohama next month?
Well, go ahead. We'll have another question. Right.
Hi, my name's Fran Graney from Deloitte, and we serve the World Bank, including the IFC, both here at headquarters and overseas. Like in India, work with IFC on the pilot solar energy project, and with the World Bank on water for the backward states. But I was recently in Asia, and I met with your chief economist, Bert Hoffman, and I asked him about his view on your initiative and your goal to eliminate poverty. And he was fully supportive, thought what the bank should do, and asked how it was going to be operationalized. And he said, well, it's going to make it easier for country directors to say no to governments, to bad ideas. So my question for you is, how do you see the portfolio of projects the bank sponsors, both across sectors and across countries, changing in order to achieve that goal?
That's a great question. So on the Yokohama, I very much look forward to being in Yokohama for the TCAD meeting. I think, the Secretary General and I are going to the Great Lakes region because this is a region that we've just got to have success in. I've worked in fragile states for most of my adult life. In Haiti, I worked in Peru during the war with the Shining Path. I've worked in Rwanda. So I've worked in a lot of these countries, and so it's very natural for me to want to focus on the fragile and conflict-affected states. And it's been so frustrating for so long. So I think we have a great opportunity. But for example, for the Great Lakes, we've really got to think about regional trade initiatives. How can we just improve the ability for goods and services to move around the area? There's a huge energy demand, but also enormous possibilities for energy generation in that area. So energy, trade, we know that agriculture has to play a huge role. We still have a lot of investments to make in health systems and education. So it's going to be a particular focus of mine to focus on the fragile and conflict-affected states. But we're trying to do something different by looking at combined political, economic, and security solutions with the UN. And also, I think one of the things that we're going to need from our governors is a little bit more flexibility in tackling regional initiatives. We're very lucky to have the African Development Bank as our a partner because they are a little bit more easily able to work with regional initiatives. But we think that's a real key. And the Secretary General and I will be going to the Sahel later in the year, again, for the same purpose of, these regions need these joint solutions. And we hope to talk about that at the TCAD meeting. And in terms of selectivity, we did our very first country partnership strategy in light of these new goals. And so what happened with the India strategy, and it was a very big group of projects, is that in the process of developing the targets, much of the focus moved toward the poorer states. So there was an increase in the investments that we're making in the poorest states because, again, we knew that if we're going to end poverty, we'd have to do it in India. Uttar Pradesh, for example, 8% of the people in the world living in absolute poverty are in that one state. We know that we have to make much bigger investments in those areas, and I think that's what it'll allow us to do. Yeah.
Thank you, and we have various, but I know you're looking at me, but it says 5 minutes there.
Yeah, we do.
So very quickly, we'll have 2 more questions and quick answer. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Christian Gonzalez. I'm from Johns Hopkins University and also from the World Bank. And my question is, in the event of the spring meetings and the idea to create the BRICS Bank, a lot of commentators are saying that the World Bank will lose its relevance in terms of lending, and it should move towards being a consulting for development in a similar fashion that President Wolfenson tried to push the Knowledge Bank. But on the other hand, I hear you saying that there's a lot of need for lending in infrastructure in BRICS, and that the bank should push more for that. And even more, I also work in business intelligence, and all of the regions are telling us President Kim thinks that AAA and knowledge products should be a priority, so they want to boost the reporting on that. So my question for both of you is actually, where do you see the balance between lending products and knowledge products for the bank? Do you think, given the limited resources, we can still do both, or should we focus on one or the other?
Last question.
My name is Angela. I'm from Georgetown University. I was at your Georgetown speech last time, so good to see you again. My question for you today is about non-BRICS countries. I think people are paying too much attention to BRICS countries. However, there are some other countries that might also have the strong growth potential, such as Vietnam, Mexico, and Turkey. So what would be the World Bank strategy in assisting those non-BRIC countries to to grow while the pressure from the BRICS countries is there?
So in terms of knowledge, I don't see it as a dichotomy at all. And the way I see it is, it's kind of funny for me, someone who's worked in small NGOs begging for money most of my adult life, to say, we're $50 billion a year, which is relatively small compared to the overall need. So would I like to see our ability to lend grow? Of course I would. But I'd like to see it grow based on a completely different conversations that we could have about the value add of the World Bank Group. To me, it's not saying you focus on one versus the other. What I'm saying is quite different. I'm saying the quality of our pipeline, the quality of our lending projects, we have to really focus on getting ever better in terms of the quality of the projects we do. We have to focus because, even though we're loans, we're lending at LIBOR plus 50 basis points. Those are our market rate loans. So it's still really, really inexpensive, and great money. And lots and lots of countries, the middle income countries, many that she's mentioned, are asking us to increase our single borrow limit so they can borrow more. Because what they know is that in addition to a low rate, they also get the full range of our technical support. We help them do the project planning, we help them do set up data systems, we help them do analysis, we help them do postdoc analysis. All of this is what the countries need. This is why China still wants to work with us, because they know that they can do something on a pilot level that will give them all this great analysis, and if they think it's going to work, they can take it to scale. Right? So I think there's no question that we've got to get better. We've got to up our game in both areas. Right? if, I'd like to see in a very short period of time, maybe in the next year or two, for us to be able to say, my goodness, you walk in the door to the World Bank and you ask them a question, and they tap into all of the expertise all through the bank and all through the world instantaneously. You can get it right away. And it's not just reports and data, it's actually people who are talking on video or whatever with experiential knowledge about how you get out of a blind alley when you're in a project. This is the kind of delivery knowledge that we hope will be available to everyone. And if we're as good as we can be in that area, I think that there's going to be an increasing call for us to be involved in projects. Most likely it's going to be we're going to put in seed funding. IFC is going to put 10% down, crowd in private capital from lots of other sources. But I think people, the better we get in our knowledge work, the more they're going to trust us being involved in these big, in determining how money is spent. And in terms of the BRICS, there's no question, Mexico, Turkey, these are very important countries. Let me just give you one, Turkey has done so much. And, frankly, Turkey is where they are today to a great extent because of this man. And I met with the Turkish Minister of Finance, and they asked me how Jim was doing, right? Because he came in and helped them at an incredibly difficult time. And that's what the bank can do. What did Jim do for Turkey in a really difficult time? He went there, brought in his friends, and restored confidence in the country. Now, there's just so many crazy things that affect whether people will invest in your country or not, whether people will give you access to capital. And these are the kinds of things that I'd like to be able to do. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do something that significant, but those are the kinds of things that the World Bank can do. Now, every single middle-income country I've met with have told me, look, I have problems with healthcare. What do the middle-income countries do? They've got now two different problems with healthcare. On the one hand, they've got to get healthcare to their poorest people, basic healthcare services. And on the other hand, in the cities, people want what we have in Washington, D.C., and in Boston, and in London. They want the very highest tech quality of healthcare. So on the one hand, in the cities, it looks to the Minister of Finance like healthcare costs could be infinitely expanding. And at the same time, they have a problem delivering healthcare to the poorest people. So I think we can help, not only in healthcare and education, but also things like how do you organize the public-private partnership deals that will build the infrastructure we need for growth that at the same time is maximally effective in creating jobs, for example, for young people. That's a complicated task, and I think that we at the World Bank have a tremendous amount of experience that we'd like to put on the table.
I think we've been enormously fortunate to have President Kim with us this morning. It just shows how the leadership has advanced in the last years. And I'm both overawed by what you're doing and grateful, and I think we all are very happy.
Thank you.